Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Evan Rogers, co-founder and CEO of True Anamoly, as well as Brad Harrison, managing partner at Scout Ventures. We're here to discuss commercialization of defense innovation and the role that cybersecurity and public-private partnerships play. On behalf of our Nasdaq US-based team and myself, the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, we thank you for you and your team's service and extend that gratitude to all veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces and our active service members. So we're grateful to have the both of you on the show today. Evan, let's kick it off with you. Give us some background briefly on where you sit within the defense tech industry.
Yeah, sure. And Jill, thank you for the comments. I was an Air Force officer for about 10 years. I was in the space operations community, and I started True Anamoly along with several other co-founders immediately out of service. So we weren't sort of positioned as many defense tech co-founders are, which is they sort of have come up with an idea when they're in the service. They may take some time off, particularly at the 10-year mark, and then go do something different. We responded to a need, an acute need that we saw while we were in uniform, and built this company in particular to build the systems that we felt that we needed for space defense and space superiority for the United States and its allies. We're pretty far behind in space superiority and space defense in particular. We're relying on an aging infrastructure, and this company is all about equipping the armed forces with the capabilities they need. So we're a defense tech and defense product company exclusively focused. I believe the only company, at least in the United States, exclusively focused on product development for space superiority.
Right. And Brad, give us background on Scout Ventures.
Sure. So also thanks for the comments for the veterans. I'm also a veteran. I was a Army Ranger after attending West Point, spent 5 years active duty, and started doing early stage venture capital, and then pivoted to focus on the intersection of national security and critical technology development. So that broadly includes AI, autonomy, robotics, drones, cyber, quantum as a sector, space as a sector, and power as a sector. And similar to Evan, my focus came out of one of my classmates and best friends getting killed in Afghanistan and feeling like I was not doing enough to serve, and figured that I could use my technology and innovation background to help the warfighter on the front lines.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the parallels between both of your companies, helping to advance that, because, Evan, the defense market opportunities certainly have seen a shift, to Brad's point, with the emerging technologies, because the good actors and the bad actors are leveraging the same type of technology, and the threat landscape has certainly shifted.
That's absolutely right. And we find ourselves in a pretty interesting situation as a nation. We're pouring billions of dollars into programs that take too long to go build. They take 10, 15, 20 years to design and build. And by the time they hit the battlefield, they're largely obsolete. Our adversaries are getting very good at cyber espionage, not only against the US government, but against defense contractors. So it's very difficult to keep secrets, to keep our asymmetric technologies secret. And the only antidote to that is speed of the defense industrial base, which really requires a new mentality around defense transactions and defense contracting. We need to go from cost plus, which incentivizes long-term, bloated, out-of-date programs, into firm fixed price, rapid iteration, and focus on software sales.
Right. And Brad, that's one of the things that you're focused on as well, because there is this high demand because of global instability and modernization. And these are capital intensive infrastructure and, regulatory projects. And the technology is just evolving, quicker than these pivots can be made.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the way the old innovation cycle used to work, somebody in the Pentagon would come up with a requirement. It would take 2 to 5 years to develop that requirement. Then you'd put that requirement out to bid. If it was something like a helicopter, it would take the primes 9 years to develop and iterate. And so by the time you got that piece of equipment in the field, it was 18 years, right? Like, that cycle doesn't work now, because for us to catch up and maintain our technological superiority, it's exactly what Evan said. We need to move quicker than the old bureaucracy allows. I relocated from New York City, where we founded the firm, to Austin, Texas, partially because they established something called Army Futures Command, where they tried to bring a bunch of the innovation outside of the Pentagon, with this idea, if they could create a different environment that wasn't in the beltway, that wasn't already part of the system, then that would allow us to get these more innovative technologies in front of, the people that were writing these programs of record, or the PEOs. And so that's been a big fundamental shift, as well as the establishment of the Defense Innovation Unit and the Office of Strategic Capital and the other organizations as an extension of DoD to provide some non-dilutive capital to help with this rapid iteration.
Yeah, and Evan, that's something that we're seeing across the board when it comes to the implementation of emerging technologies, the role that PPPs, private-public partnerships, are playing, not just in, your traditional tech sectors, but national security. There is no margin for error when you think about national security. Again, as the threat landscape has gone from, different types of warfare to perhaps enemies you can't see because of the technology behind it.
Yeah, this is the fundamental value proposition of a defense tech or a defense product company, is the leveraging of private capital, either from profits or from the private capital markets, venture in particular, to generate a thesis about a technology that can be delivered quickly to the warfighter, and then to see that through to production and then into scale. That's what we do at Anamoly. We have a strong thesis about the evolution and the nature and the character of conflict in the space domain. And we bring tens of millions of our own private capital to bear on national security space problems, generate a product that can be scaled very quickly, and then provide that product to a variety of different customers. This is a fundamentally different value proposition to the way that the traditional large system integrators work, which is exactly as Brad just described. Now, there's risk associated with that, because you're expending your own capital for the purposes of product development, which is what most great tech companies do. But there seem to be more one-way doors in the Pentagon than perhaps there are in the rest of tech. So you need that necessitates a wider ranging product strategy approach than maybe you would take in traditional tech.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially tell us about Mosaic, right? Because it's software-led product development that you're focused on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Mosaic is an opportunity for us. It's an absolute necessity for our product strategy, in the sense that it's what provides the autonomy for our spacecraft to operate in a contested environment. It means also we can offload requirements from the spacecraft to software and to autonomy, which is very important to keeping costs down and keeping performance adaptable to the threat.
Yeah. Let's talk about cybersecurity and the implications there, Brad, for a moment, because as the threat landscape expands, so does the vulnerabilities. And when I think about, national security, cybersecurity is really what's at top of mind. I mean, it touches every aspect and it impacts our critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, last year I was at the White House a couple of times, focused with the National Security Council as AI pertained to cybersecurity and our critical infrastructure. So think about AI as part of a national resilience defense strategy. And one of the core components there is the cybersecurity across all that critical infrastructure. You mentioned earlier corporate espionage, right? If anybody remembers when they released the new Chinese 6th generation fighter, it looks remarkably like our own fighter. And, whether or not part of that is corporate espionage, where they're stealing designs, it is something that we need to be worried about. And we are only as vulnerable as our least secure endpoint. And I think that's a really big deal. And I think part of what you're seeing is, I think hacks are starting to become commonplace. Mm-hmm. When a cell network goes down for a day, my assumption is that it's probably been hacked. Same thing with a lot of our different systems. I think in the defense space, a lot of what we see is the risk is so high that a lot of the computers are air-gapped, and we're not actually keeping some of the sensitive things in places where it's vulnerable to hackers. But it is a primary thing we do in all of our defense companies, which are mostly software-based, is how do we protect that software?
Right. And to your point about vulnerable endpoints, at the end of the day, there are humans in the loop, right? And we're not 100% perfect, like, programs have the potential to be. And whether it's malicious intent or not, it's, that's always going to be at the forefront. And that comes down to training and the culture of these companies. And, honestly, the culture at the top of government, to think privacy first, cyber by design. And, rather than it being a cost, this is what's going to be effective for businesses to be able to carry on. And it's going to be necessary, for the US to, maintain its leadership and its strength in innovation and, who we are as a global superpower.
Well, it's interesting because, Evan mentioned this use of their own private capital. I'm sure one of the things driving that is the $19 billion that Space Force is allocating towards space domain awareness and the types of things that True Anomaly and Evan is focused on. Those dollars from DoD are critical to matching the private dollars and helping these companies get through the valley of death. And without that money, there's just not enough private capital. And it takes time to build these and the government to figure out what they really need and how they can buy it. So, this public-private partnership is a really important part of the innovation cycle.
Right. It certainly is. And Evan, let me ask you this question in a different way. You and Brad and your teams have exceptional, rare skill sets. From, looking at this more holistically, does the workforce have the skill sets to effectively execute on these national security and critical infrastructure priorities?
The workforce absolutely does have the skill sets. What we're seeing are a couple of pretty interesting trends, though, that end up acting as constraints for defense tech companies. But we're seeing an evolution in these constraints. So one of them is the flocking of great talent to defense tech companies. Companies like Anduril and True Anomaly and Shield and Saronic are able to recruit the world's best talent because the labor force is interested in doing hard things. When you come out of college, you don't sort of think, man, how can I devote my life to building the next best dating app or the next best dog walking app? So interest is actually not the problem. One of the constraints that we find is actually clearable individuals. So the vast majority of our work is unclassified. However, when you're delivering capabilities to customers, that has to be done by a segment of the population of our workforce that is cleared. To get a clearance, you have to be clearable in the first place. And the proportionality of cleared, very high quality, world-class engineers is pretty small.
Yeah. Well, asking as a layperson, what are some of the common hurdles that you see where clearance becomes an issue? Is it something that can be fixed or they can be trained on?
Yeah, it's largely recreational drug use is the problem. Yeah, that's largely it. But I think you're going to start to see some changes as well in clearance standards, but it's not clear that that's the case quite yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really is, fascinating work, and it's almost hard to wrap your head around all the technology that goes behind it, and then the coordination and what it takes to, execute on these priorities. It really is quite fascinating where you're thinking about troops on the ground or the priorities that you're working on as it relates to space and other cybersecurity initiatives. How are we in the first inning, or are we competitive, at least when it comes to, other areas of the world?
Well, I think the first thing just to highlight is, Evan talked about the labor force side of the equation. There's a supply chain raw material supply issue that we have as well. So if you look at three components that go in almost all pieces of autonomy: batteries, sensors, LiDAR, thermal cameras, and third, brushless motors and the electronic control boards that run them. 80 to 85% of those components come from China today. And when we do find a US supplier, the price can be 100 times more. 100 times. Like you're talking about, it's in a world where we're now moving to more attritable autonomy, right? Where now we're not building these big complex drones for $3-4 million, right? We're trying to build these autonomous devices for $20,000-$25,000. I can't do that if I have to spend $3,000 on batteries and $5,000 on a LiDAR camera, right? I'm never going to be able to get to that price point. So one of the big things that's in discussion now is this idea of having a domestic consortium to solve some of these core supply chain issues, which ultimately are related to national security.
Yeah. But Brad, you made the point before too. It's not like you flip a switch and your supply chain, it's costly, it's capital intensive, it takes time. And it's almost a paradox where you're reliant on an adversary to build, these types of products, whether it's software, hardware, but it's not something where you can just, right size that ship and it's on shore the next day.
Correct. And that's why I think, almost all of our companies, even if they have a hardware platform, really the focus is on the software, right? Where we think about the hardware as the commodity or the delivery system, really where we spend our time is on developing fundamental new software around the AI, autonomy, and those pieces, which help deliver whatever it is to the end warfighter.
Right. And Evan, to wrap it up here, whether it's outlook or where we are within this race right now, how would you grade our progress?
I think we're at the very first innings of the transformation of the defense industrial base, but we're dangerously close to the end of the game that's required for meaningful deterrence against Russia and China. So there's a mismatch in where we are on the timeline, and the only solution is just to be able to go faster with precision. So the Pentagon, the United States intelligence apparatus talks pretty regularly, invokes China's timelines for a potential Taiwan invasion. And those are sooner than I think most of the American public would realize, 24, 36 months. That's what Indo-PACOM is preparing for. That's what US EUCOM is preparing for, excuse me. And so the defense industrial base has to make the pivot faster because we're starting from behind, and that really takes the DoD showing up with meaningful acquisition change.
All right. Appreciate both of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks, Jill.